Welcome to Despatches, a shorter podcast from the old front line and me, military historian Paul Reed. In this episode, we'll look at war damage postcards of the First World War, pictures of those smashed landscapes of the Western Front, and we'll ask, what do they tell us about the history of that conflict and the battlefields they depict? I gave a talk this week to members of the Old Frontline podcast supporters community about postcards of Ypres, the anvil of sacrifice of the British and Empire forces during those 4 years of the Great War. And I used those postcards to discuss the history of the city before, during, and after the conflict. This wasn't just a kind of random collection of images. These images brought together did help tell a coherent story and shed light on some different aspects of Great War history. And those kind of talks are one of the benefits of being part of our Old Frontline community. And for this particular talk, I recorded it for those who couldn't tune in live, and I've put it up on the Old Frontline YouTube channel if you'd like to watch it, and it just gives you an idea of the kind of things that we do. But more importantly for this episode of Despatches, getting the talk together, it made me think of the types of photographs and postcards that I was selecting from the Old Frontline archives, if you like, the ones that I was using to illustrate the talk. It made me think about those, and it made me reminisce about those early years of my interest and passion for the Great War, and how easy it was really to find those kind of postcards. And across Sussex, where I was living then in the early 1980s, there were junk shops everywhere, there were car boot sales, there were flea markets, and you could go to these places and find them. And I also discovered that there were postcard fairs. You could go to those, and there were professional postcard sellers, and they would have boxes of all kinds of postcards, of topographical stuff of your local town and particular types of imagery, and there'd be a military section. And one of those military subsections that you often saw in those boxes of postcards was a section called War Damage postcards, depicting the damage to the battlefields of the First World War. And it was really easy to pick them up in those days. No one really wanted them. I had many dealers that kind of gave me fistfuls of cards for just pennies, really. And although they are a little bit more expensive all these years later, I've had quite a few emails from people lately asking about collecting postcards, and this is quite a easy kind of gateway into that, by looking for these types of images, by looking for pictures of towns and cities and villages and battlefields that were destroyed. They're quite common. So it made me start to think really further about this whole subject of war damage postcards and what they tell us really about the history and the battlefields of the Great War. So that name, War Damage Postcards, where does that kind of come from? Well, it comes really, it's not a contemporary name for them, although I'm sure probably people did have some kind of name to describe that kind of genre of postcard. And you've got to remember that the Great War generation was a postcard generation in the Edwardian period. This was a massive peak in the production and sending of postcards within Edwardian Britain. And it wasn't just pictures of your street, of your village, of your town that people were collecting and sending. It was all kinds of things, humorous postcards, imagery of king and country and empire and all this kind of stuff. And when the war came along, it gave these postcard producers even more for them to, subject-wise, for them to produce cards. And the Great War saw this massive peak, even higher peak of the production of postcards that were then sent by soldiers. And we've spoken recently on the Old Front Line about the whole postal system in the Great War, and these postcards were very much kind of at the centre of that, being sent backwards and forwards from the trenches of the Great War. But that term war damage, it comes from postcard dealers that I remember back in the kind of 80s and into the 90s that would have these little shoe boxes with the postcards in that were for sale, and there would be this little tab that said war damage, and you'd go in there and you'd find all these places that you'd read about, from Flanders down to the Somme and Verdun, and there were these postcards. So that's kind of where the name comes from, and that's how the title of this podcast came about. And it's a term that's still used, I believe, by postcard collectors. But who made these postcards? Well, when you look at them, most of them are French produced, and you've got to think that during the Great War, when soldiers were out of the line, British and Commonwealth soldiers were out of the line, they were in villages and towns behind the front, places like Bethune and Albert and Amiens and Popringer and Lillers, and all these places that were kind of key points in the rear area of the British Army on the Western Front. And in pretty much all those places, the civilian population continued to live, and they did make money out of the fact that there were all these thousands of soldiers there with money in their pockets to spend. And they provided food and drink and all the other stuff, but postcards were a big part of this. And French postcard manufacturers, they then produced these cards that were then sold by the French people to the soldiers in shops, in the equivalent of a newsagent, Maison de la Presse, or something like that. And so soldiers, when they're out of the line, could buy these things. And some men used them as kind of souvenirs. It showed places where they'd fought, and they kept them as souvenirs of their war service. And I've got albums with those kind of laid out in that way. And others just used them as a bit of kind of postal currency to send a letter off to Ma, or to their uncle, or to their sister, or their girlfriend, or whatever it was. And so soldiers were exposed to these postcards on quite a big scale, and they became, in some respects, a kind of important part of the soldiers' experience. And every veteran that I ever interviewed had a little pile of these somewhere, tucked away perhaps with his medals and his old cap badge and other mementos from his war service. Almost every soldier that I've researched on behalf of a family, they often have them as well. And they can be vital clues in trying to piece together a soldier's service. So if you've got postcards of Ypres and the Somme and Arras, it's kind of indicating where that soldier had been. And in particular for the early war period of 1914-15, in the kind of lead up to the year of the Battle of the Somme, from a British and Commonwealth perspective, these postcards I think are quite important, because that was a period in which there were no British official photographers taking images of the battlefields. And these French photographers who were going around producing images that were then put onto these postcards, quite a lot of these are now in French archives. There's a website, galicia.fr, which has got a massive collection of the type of images that you see on these contemporary war damage postcards. They have kind of given us an archive of images from that early war period. So in that respect, they're also really important documents as well. So what we're going to do in this next part of the podcast is take an example of some of these cards, and I'm going to talk you through them, and I'll put images of the postcards onto the podcast website. And we're going to roughly work our way from north to south along the British and Commonwealth battlefields of the Western Front. And I'm holding the postcards in my hand now. So if we're going to go from north to south, we're going to go from Flanders down to the Somme, essentially. So the first postcard I'm holding is a picture, a panoramic picture of the city of Ypres. The title of it is Ypres Panorama, Bird's Eye View. And when I turn it over, it's published by Anthony of Ypres, who was a local photographer in the city before the war, a well-known local photographer who had captured in what we'd call the Edwardian period some really classic images of the old medieval city of Ypres. And when the war came along, he took some images. He had to flee Ypres in 1915 along with the civilian population, and then he returned after the war, and he saw a business opportunity to take images of what the battlefields looked at that stage once they began to see battlefield pilgrims and then tourists coming to the old front line areas. And what this image shows, and it's been kind of monochromed, it's been tinted slightly, it shows the ruins of the city of Ypres. In the centre of the postcard is the tallest building that was left standing in Ypres, which was the cloth hall, the old medieval cloth hall where the cloth had been bought and sold. And when we look at this, and I mentioned this in the talk that I gave, I kind of look at these images and they do look like the ruins of some ancient civilization. You know, this could be Roman ruins or Greek ruins, but here it is, it's medieval buildings that have been destroyed in just 4 years of war, crushed and obliterated and smashed and torn apart by the hand of war. And this kind of classic image showing this landscape of a city, a once proud city that had nearly 17,000 population, over 2,300 buildings in the city, and there's vast open spaces where these buildings had once been, and it's utter desolation and ruinous buildings. And kind of following that through, the next card is much more typical of these kind of classic war damage postcards with French captions. This one is La Grande Guerre 1914-15, the Great War 1914-15, Bataille. Now this one has been censored, it's been sent through the British Army postal system, so it's crossed out the name of where it is, and then the name of the place, après le bombardement, after the bombardments, crossed out there, and the English translation has also got the name crossed out. But looking at it, we're looking across some damaged buildings and rooftops towards the tower of the Cloth Hall and St Martin's Cathedral. This is Ypres. And on the back of this card, it says, "Dear Albert, just a few lines. There was a young man asking after you tonight, so I gave him your address. He is Norman Bortright out of Abingdon Road. Love to all, Bob." And of course, that's a message lost in the passage of time between Bob and Albert as to who that lad was. But this is a postcard picked up by a soldier when he's out of the line, showing a city that he's probably just been to as he's marched up the line to take part in the fighting, perhaps during the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, and he sent this home as a souvenir. And it shows the kind of progression. That one, the first one, is a postcard showing the whole kind of city smashed to pieces by shell fire. This one shows the progression of damage, and that's kind of what these images are really good for and important for, showing just how these battlefields could gradually be ground down by the fighting. Now, we're still in Flanders, but we're going to move behind the lines now. And this next postcard has actually got an inscription in Flemish, in Dutch. It says Oorlog, which is war, 1914, 15, 16. And it shows a row of houses. The centre one smashed to bits by a shell blast, the walls torn down, the roof blown off, damage to both buildings either side. And then there's two groups of local children looking on. Now, in most of these places close to the front, and even in Ypres up to 1915, the civilian population remained there. The British couldn't move them away forcibly, and it was only really when gas came in and there wasn't enough gas masks for British soldiers, they couldn't supply them to Belgian civilians. That's when we had to ask the population of Ypres to finally leave. But this isn't Ypres, this is behind the lines. It's Popperinge bombarded. The ruins of the Rue des Pots, the Potterstraat, and this shows the kind of damage to a place that's quite some way behind the lines, but long-range, heavy-caliber German guns sent shells over to Popperinge because they knew it was a concentration area, first for the French, and then from 1915 onwards for the British, and some buildings were destroyed. When you go to Popperinge today, you see that the majority of the town still retains a lot of its original buildings from the period, not destroyed, some damaged, a few blown apart, but nothing like Ypres and nothing like the main battlefield area. And this little one kind of gives us a bit of a clue as to the kind of damage that took place within the streets of Popperinge, but also it's the kind of postcard that soldiers would pick up in places where they were billeted, because they weren't just picking up souvenirs of their battlefield areas, they spent much more time in some respects behind the lines, and these kind of postcards showing the villages where they slept and the farmsteads and the streets that they walked around, and perhaps even the estaminets where they drank, these were really popular as kind of these war damage postcards as well. Now, staying in Flanders still, we're going to move back onto the battlefield area, and this is a postcard produced by Nels, and that was a Belgian company that produced an awful lot of postcards post-war showing the battlefields and the memorials and the cemeteries, and it also captured imagery of what the battlefields looked like immediately after the war. And this one is the ruins of Kemmel Hill, 1918. On the summit of the hill, a shell hole and its contents. And this kind of gives us an insight into the ironmongery, the iron harvest as it became known, but that's when the shells are dug up. But this is kind of the detritus of war that is still lying there on the ground just a few short months after the end of the conflict. And this is quite a big shell hole, and in it is a huge caliber shell. And the shell actually looks to me to be British, 9.2, possibly even 12 inch. It's got a very wide driving band on it, which would indicate a British shell rather than a German one. Their driving bands, their copper driving bands, were normally a lot narrower. And there's other shells in there as well. What looks like a German Minenwerfer shell, and some steel helmets, British steel helmets in there as well. But you kind of look at this from an archaeological point of view, and this is the bottom of a shell hole with some wobbly tin in there as well, some elephant iron, and this could easily just be kind of covered over with a bit more detritus thrown in, and there all that stuff is still sitting there beneath the surface as the archaeology of the Great War a century later, and archaeologists like Simon Verdigam comes along, and this is the kind of stuff that they find. So this kind of gives us an insight into what the kind of surface level of the battlefields look like. So we're going to drop down from Belgium and Flanders down into northern France, and we're near to Arras now. And this is a postcard of the village of Mont-Saint-Éloi near Arras. The guerre 1914-16, 1914-16, and it's the ruins, it says in French, the ruins of the towers of the abbey. And this was the Abbey of Mont-Saint-Éloi. It was an old monastery site, and this was two twin towers that stood on the hillside there that came under shell fire, and you can see the visible damage to these towers. Later on in the war, beneath these towers, there was a Royal Flying Corps and later Royal Naval Air Service airfield, and an RNAS pilot is said to have flown his aircraft between these towers at some point, I think in about 1917. And it looks impossible when you kind of look at this photograph, but you can see this ruin. It's still there today on the hillside at Mont-Saint-Éloi, an original Great War ruin damaged by shell fire and now preserved as a national monument. And you can go there, and when you see the gap between the towers, you can see with the aircraft tipped on its side, it was just about possible for this pilot to get through. But this image, this simple kind of postcard, which when I look at the back, it cost me 5 pence to buy all those years ago. It kind of connects us to that really important place just behind the lines at Arras. And again, this was a village where Highland troops and Canadians were billeted in the eve of the fighting in 1917, and one of them's picked this up and had it as a souvenir. So I think these, they're quite tactile, these postcards. You can hold them, you can kind of feel sometimes the mud on them, and you can see the writing of the ones that have been postally used. But they're kind of far more than that. You really do kind of connect us to the events and the places on these battlefields. And staying near to Arras, we're moving a little bit down the road to Ablain-Saint-Nazaire, which is a village beneath the hill of Notre-Dame-de-Lorette, where the fighting was in 1915 involving the French army. And this is a postcard from that period that shows the ruins of the village of Ablain-Saint-Nazaire, with the beginning of the high grounds leading up to Notre-Dame-de-Lorette behind it. And there's some French soldiers, some bonhommes, some poilus standing there, a couple of stretcher bearers, brancardiers, you can see their armbands on their uniform there. And there's a gentleman standing in the foreground with a beret and a kind of work jacket on. He's got some medals that look to be much earlier campaigns, and he's holding a big metal tin. And what it says underneath is, "The mayor coming back to his destroyed house after the departure of the Germans." In French, they use the phrase Boche. "Finds again everything belonging to him." So basically, he'd buried his prized possessions in this tin close to his house, and once the Germans had been thrown out in the fighting there of May of 1915, he's then gone in and dug his little box up and retrieved his possessions. So it's a kind of fascinating snapshot of one aspect of the fighting there. And the building behind him, which I'm guessing is his house, has been used as a aid post. There's a Red Cross flag up, and like we said, there's those two stretcher bearers standing there waiting to receive the wounded. So these postcards not only kind of show us buildings and streets and places, they kind of tell us little stories as well. So we're going to move down to the Somme now, and we're going to start off behind what was the German lines, and later on as the withdrawal to the Hindenburg line by the Germans and advance to the Hindenburg line to the British took place. We're in the town of Péronne, where the Historial de la Grande Guerre Museum is today. And this is a postcard of the main square of Péronne with a town hall. And it was rebuilt pretty much in the same style after the war, with these archways in front of it. It's a very distinct building. And this street, which was the principal street through the middle of the town, was eventually renamed Rue de Kanga by the mayor, I think in about 1998, in memory of the Australians, because they named it that when they captured, finally liberated Péronne in September of 1918. And it was a play on the French spelling for the word for street, which is rue, R-U-E, but they spelt it R-O-O and called it Rue de Kanga, and that street is now officially called that. But on the building is a big sign that says Nicht ärgern nur wundern, and this sign survives. The sign that's in this picture survives, and it's in the Historial Museum at Péronne. It hangs up on the wall there, and roughly translated it means don't be angry but only admire. And it was a kind of a farcical statement, I suspect, on the state of this town, which has got ruined buildings on one side and damage to the main building of the town hall. So that's Péronne. And then we're going to move on to the 1916 sector now, and we're in Albert. And again, this is a censored card, and I know it's Albert because I can see some very familiar landmarks, the Basilica with the statue of Mary with her outstretched arms holding the infant Jesus. This is a pre-war image of the town, and although this doesn't show any damage, soldiers bought these to kind of show these places what they look like, sent them back to family, kept them as souvenirs. So this is a kind of very different view to probably what they had when they arrived. But the name Albert has been, in this case, not scribbled out by the censor. It's actually been scratched off the postcard. And the person who acquired this has written on the back of it in filled pencil, "Nothing like it now," which is a kind of an understatement, saying that the town looks nothing like this now. And if we go to the next one I'm holding here of Albert, this is sometime later during the winter of 1916-17. It shows the tower of the Basilica damaged by artillery fire, the main building in a kind of semi-ruinous state, the figure of Mary at that 90-degree angle. She's now the Golden Virgin or the Leaning Virgin. Fanny Durack, as the Australian soldiers called her. Fanny Durack was an Australian Olympic swimmer who had won a gold medal at the 1912 Olympics, and they reckoned this figure at this roughly kind of 90-degree angle looked like Fanny Durack diving into an Olympic swimming pool. But this image, there's snow on the ground, and Albert is indeed very different now because this is the kind of wartime ruinous state. And this is only halfway through the war, and there was another 2 years of conflict to come, and in 1918 in particular, both sides damaged this. The Germans captured it in March 1918, the British then bombarded it, and Albert was in a terrible, damaged, ruinous state by the end of the Great War. And those two postcards kind of, as the then and now, the pre-war image and the later war image, gives us a bit of an insight into that. And going out onto that 1916 battlefield, this one shows a familiar place name. This one has not been postally sent, it's not scribbled out, and if it was scribbled out, I don't think we'd really know where it was, because it just shows a collection of ruinous buildings, a bit of a roof frame, a couple of walls standing, the rest of it smashed to bits. And this is the village of Chapval in ruins. And it shows a couple of French soldiers on it, which is quite interesting. What French soldiers were doing there at that time, I don't know. And this gives us a kind of typical insight into those villages that were on the 1916 battlefield, just pulverised by those 4.5 months of fighting during that great offensive of 1916, when pretty much nothing survived on those battlefields. The villages fought over time and again, some of them changing hands, first being bombarded by the British to be taken, and then being bombarded by the Germans when the British took them and defended them, and village after village after village ends up in this ruinous state. I think Ernst Junger is one of many soldier writers that describes this. He says in Storm of Steel that they only really realised that they were approaching a village sometimes when the colour of the earth changed and the buildings that had once populated that village had stained the earth from the colour of their brickwork or their stonework, and that kind of smudge in the mud gave an indication that they were walking into the site of a former village. So it's kind of difficult for us to imagine sometimes just the level of destruction that there was in the Great War, and these images give us a really important insight into that. And darting out onto the French sector of the Somme for 1916, and obviously a lot of these postcards being produced by French manufacturers and French companies and being distributed by French people had a lot of French subject matter in them. And in that French sector of the Somme, where the French army were fighting along the River Somme itself, there's a lot of postcards of that area and some really good ones. And this is one of my favourite. I think it's an absolutely stunning war photo. It shows an old cafe restaurant smashed by shell fire. The shutters are blown off. Part of the sign for the restaurant is still there. You can see inside with some of the old wallpaper on the walls. The door's still there and shut firmly, and sitting outside of it is three poilus, three bonhommes, sitting there and waiting to go up the line or have just come back from the line. And this is the village of Herbicourt, which was heavily fought over during that Franco-English offensive of 1916, as it refers to on the postcards. It says it's the ruins of Lanné's hostelry in Herbicourt. So this was a particular cafe well known within the village, not serving any pinard or any kind of drink when these French soldiers were there. But this is a stunning, stunning image. You can see shrapnel marks on the whitewashed walls. You can see impact marks in the brickwork. And it kind of gives you an insight into what these ruined villages on the Somme looked like when the soldiers first entered them during the fighting, because they weren't all blown to pieces immediately. When villages like Pozières and Courcelette and others were captured by the Canadians, for example, at Courcelette, this kind of building would have been standing in this kind of way. And here down on the French sector, that's exactly the same kind of experience as them. And whenever I look at these pictures of the French sector of the Somme, I always think of the late Dave O'Mara, who has written extensively on that part of the Somme battlefields and given that part of the Somme very much a voice through his books by Pen and Sword, which are well worth seeking out. And then we'll end with just a kind of simple postcard, not so much showing a ruin, although the landscape that I'm looking at is a ruinous landscape. There's no landmarks whatsoever. Grass has begun to return on this image. I can see some wildflowers amongst that grass. And in the distance, there's a valley and a ridge beyond. There's nothing, no building, no structure, no church, nothing. It's a wasteland. It's an overgrown wasteland, but it's clear that it's a wasteland. And in the foreground of the image, going on and on and on in row after row after row, are crosses, because this is a cemetery. In this case, it's a cemetery near to Bazentin. Now, it calls it Bazentin Cemetery, but I'm pretty sure that this is Caterpillar Valley that is in between Bazentin, Le Grand and Longueval village, because the ridgeline beyond looks very much like the ridgeline that High Wood sits on. And the types of burials, including quite a lot of communal burials I can see with the crosses here, is very much typical of Caterpillar Valley Cemetery. And this is the kind of follow-on type of war damage postcard, not being bought during the war by the soldiers, but increasingly being bought by the pilgrims who visited those battlefields in that post-war period. And this gives us an insight into another chapter, really, of the history of these places. It's a fascinating objects, really. I mean, these postcards, Great War artifacts in their own right, not only depicts images of those battlefields of more than a century ago, and not only do they frequently preserve messages of soldiers from those trenches and shell-smashed villages of the Western Front. In many ways, for me, these war damage postcards are actually part of the whole culture of the old front line. You've been listening to Despatches, part of the Old Front Line podcast, with me, military historian Paul Reed. If you've enjoyed this episode, please think about leaving a review on your favourite podcast platform, giving us a rating, and leaving a comment on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk. You can follow us on Twitter, and if you want to support the podcast, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/oldfrontline, or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Thanks for listening, and see you again soon.